They saw the spotlight. They heard the velvet-rich voice that could silence an entire crowd. But what the world didn't see was the cost of keeping that voice alive. When Gene Watson stepped onto a stage in the late 70s, fans imagined a man living the dream. Chart-topping records, endless applause, and the kind of fame most singers only chase in their sleep. Yet behind the glow of stage lights hid an exhausting rhythm that few could survive. Long stretches of highway blurred into one another. Town after town began to feel the same. The roar of the crowd at night was followed by the lonely hum of bus engines at dawn. At first, Gene convinced himself it was worth it. Every encore meant another chance to prove that traditional country still mattered in an industry that was fast drifting toward pop-flavored trends. But the constant travel, the radio interviews, the recording sessions that lasted until sunrise, all of it began to take a quiet toll. His voice, that deep instrument of emotion, needed rest. The man behind it rarely got any. While his songs spoke of love and faith, his own faith was tested by fatigue and the quiet pressure of staying relevant in a business that moves faster than any tour bus. The real heartbreak came not from fading applause, but from watching the industry shift around him. Newer, flashier acts flooded the charts, and labels chased whatever could sell quickest. Gene's sound, pure, unfiltered, achingly honest, suddenly felt old-fashioned to executives chasing crossover hits. But he refused to bend completely. Instead of chasing the trends, he doubled down on sincerity. It was a risk, and it nearly cost him more than fame. Friends recall him questioning whether he still belonged in a world where image sometimes mattered more than truth. That struggle behind the curtain forged the resilience that would later define him. It's easy to sing about heartbreak. It's harder to live it quietly while pretending everything's fine. Yet even in those uncertain years, Gene's devotion to storytelling never wavered. Each time he walked onto a stage, he poured every ounce of exhaustion, doubt, and stubborn hope into the microphone. And the audiences could feel it. That raw vulnerability became his armor, the very thing that kept him going when commercial winds turned cold. But long before the bright lights and the heartbreak of fame, there was a boy in East Texas who already understood struggle. The grit that carried Gene through his hardest years wasn't born in the studio. It was born in red dirt, small churches, and wooden front porches where music wasn't a career, but a way to survive. To understand how that strength took root, we have to go back to the cotton fields, the church pews, and a childhood where every note was a prayer and every prayer was a melody. Palestine, Texas, 1943. The world was at war, but for the Watson family, the daily battles were fought closer to home. Battles against poverty, against uncertainty, and sometimes against the rough edges of life itself. In a small wooden house that barely kept out the wind, Gene was born into a world where faith and hard work weren't choices. They were survival tools. His parents were no strangers to sacrifice. They worked long hours, moving from farm to farm, just to put food on the table. Yet amid the struggle, there was always music. It drifted through the thin walls of their home like a promise. Gene's mother had a voice that could lift spirits on the hardest days, and his father's hands could coax harmony from a guitar or a worn-down harmonica. Those evenings around the family table became his first stage. The melodies were simple. Old gospel hymns, country laments, and the kind of songs that carried more truth than polish. Sitting beside them, little Gene listened with wide-eyed wonder. He didn't just hear notes. He heard feeling. He learned that music could heal what words alone couldn't. That lesson would stay with him for life. When the family moved again and again, music became their constant companion. The rhythm of work in the fields blended with the rhythm of song. The sounds of insects, the creak of porch boards, even the steady scrape of farm tools, all became part of Gene's early soundtrack. By the time he was 12, that soundtrack had turned into performance. Local churches, community gatherings, and small-town talent shows gave him his first taste of an audience. He wasn't the loudest or most confident kid on stage, but there was something magnetic about his sincerity. He didn't just sing the song, he felt it. And the people listening felt it too. Those East Texas years taught him lessons no classroom could offer. The long days repairing things that broke, the fences, the farm equipment, the old cars, taught patience and precision. The quiet nights spent humming under a starlit sky taught reflection. And through it all, his parents reminded him that humility mattered more than applause. When neighbors came by to listen, his father would smile and say, "Sing it like you mean it, boy. Otherwise, it's just noise." That simple line became a lifelong creed. Even as hardship followed the family, the Watsons found purpose in their faith and music. The church gatherings where his mother led hymns would later echo in Gene's stage performances. The same heartfelt pauses, the same emotional depth, the same sense of reaching people's souls rather than just their ears. The church was not only a sanctuary, it was his first audience training ground. Each song, whether sung for 5 or 50 people, mattered equally. Those roots, rough, humble, and deeply musical, created the foundation for everything that would come later. The world would one day know Gene Watson for his smooth baritone and timeless songs. But the essence of that voice was shaped long before a microphone ever touched his hand. It was shaped by red dirt roads, gospel choirs, and the quiet dignity of a family that believed in music's power to keep hope alive. And as the boy from East Texas grew older, the same hands that once fixed broken engines would soon hold a microphone, carrying the sound of every mile he'd traveled and every lesson he'd learned. But first, he had to learn how to balance those two worlds, the grease-stained workbench by day and the neon-lit honky-tonks by night. And that's where the next chapter begins, the moment Gene Watson turned everyday labor into the music that would change his life forever. By the time Gene Watson entered his late teens, the boy who once sang under the dim glow of church lanterns was facing a much harsher light, the one that came from a welding torch in a Texas garage. After leaving school to help his family, he found himself surrounded not by microphones, but by metal. The clang of tools, the hiss of engines, and the smell of grease became the soundtrack of his early adulthood. Yet even there, among the broken fenders and oil-stained floors, music refused to leave him alone. Between the steady rhythm of hammer strikes, he could hear a beat. In the hum of engines, he caught a tone. His world might have been mechanical, but his heart kept time with melody. Each day, after hours of labor, he'd wipe his hands clean, grab his guitar, and head to small gatherings where the sound of fiddles and laughter replaced the whir of machines. Those nights weren't glamorous. Just a couple of locals, a few drinks, and a corner stage made from plywood. But to Gene, they were everything. It was where he learned that an honest voice could hush a noisy room faster than any amplifier could. Every song he sang in those dusty honky-tonks carried the weight of the day behind it. The fatigue, the hope, the quiet dreams that only surfaced after midnight. Balancing the two worlds wasn't easy, The physical strain of his job often clashed with the delicate control his singing required. Some nights his voice cracked from exhaustion, yet he refused to skip a show. He'd joke that repairing cars paid the bills, but singing fixed his soul. The dual life taught him more than any music class could: discipline, timing, patience, and above all, humility. If a performance went poorly, there was always another shift waiting at the garage to remind him that fame wasn't guaranteed, and that humility was never out of style. The contrast between grease and guitar also became his secret strength. While many performers entered the scene polished and rehearsed, Gene's music came with calloused hands and a working man's truth. When he sang about heartbreak, listeners believed him because he'd lived through struggle himself. When he sang about faith, it didn't sound like a sermon. It sounded like survival. The honesty in his tone wasn't trained, it was earned. During this period, Gene started experimenting with songwriting, scribbling verses on spare scraps of paper between car repairs. Each lyric came from observation, the people he met, the loneliness of the road, the hope that flickered even on the toughest days. That raw material became the blueprint for the songs that would later define his career. The garage might have paid his wages, but it was also his writing room, his rehearsal hall, and his test of endurance. Eventually, word began to spread beyond the garage walls. People didn't just bring cars for repair. They asked him to sing while he worked. It wasn't unusual for a customer to lean on a doorframe, listening as Gene hummed softly over the sound of tools. Music followed him everywhere, like a loyal companion refusing to let him quit. But no matter how many locals admired his voice, success still felt miles away. The Texas sun set on his dreams many times before it finally rose again. Yet Gene kept going. Each verse he sang, each car he fixed, built a kind of faith in himself that no setback could shake. That faith would soon lead him to a small-town stage, where the smell of whiskey mixed with cigarette smoke, and where his name would begin to mean something. That first taste of recognition didn't come from studios or managers. It came from the dance floors of East Texas. And that brings us to the next step in his journey, where the small-town stages became his classroom and the audience his toughest teacher. When Gene stepped onto the uneven wooden stage of his first honky-tonk, he wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing connection. The crowd that night wasn't polite or predictable. They wanted energy, truth, and a rhythm that could drown out the noise of their own hard lives. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the clink of bottles. But when Gene sang, people stopped talking. It wasn't because he shouted louder. It was because his voice carried a kind of calm authority. You could tell he'd seen the same kind of struggles they had. Those early nights were his real schooling. There were no sound engineers, no luxury tour buses, just raw trial and error. Sometimes the crowd loved him. Other times, they barely looked up. But each show taught him how to read a room, how to shift tempo when the dance floor slowed, and how to keep his composure when drunks heckled from the back. Slowly, the man who once sang hymns in church learned how to command a crowd in a bar. And in both places, his goal was the same. The Watson Brothers Band took shape during these long nights. Playing alongside his siblings added warmth and harmony to his voice. Each of them brought a different flavor to the mix. One leaned toward blues, another toward traditional country, and Gene became the bridge between them. Their sets blended grit with grace, laughter with heartbreak. And when the music hit right, the room would swell with energy that no radio single could capture. But those gigs weren't easy. Payment was uncertain, equipment was scarce, and exhaustion was constant. The band often traveled long distances in unreliable vehicles, chasing shows that barely covered gas money. Still, every mile brought new lessons. Gene learned how to manage a team, how to improvise when an instrument broke, and how to adapt his voice to any room, whether it was a dance hall or a dimly lit diner. Each mistake became part of his education. He also began recording simple demos during this time, just rough tapes made on borrowed equipment. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but the emotion was. Those recordings started circulating among small radio stations and producers. Some ignored them, but a few noticed something rare, a voice that didn't sound manufactured. The more he sang, the more refined his craft became. Audiences began requesting his songs by name, and small-town DJs started mentioning him on air. Slowly, the circle widened. For Gene, this phase wasn't about chasing stardom. It was about learning endurance. The late nights and unpredictable crowds tested his patience, but they also sharpened his storytelling instinct. Each set became a conversation with the audience. He didn't sing to them, he sang with them. That difference, subtle yet powerful, made him unforgettable. And somewhere between the bar fights, the laughter, and the clinking glasses, a dream began to take shape. Gene realized that the songs he sang in those cramped spaces could carry far beyond the county lines of East Texas. The same authenticity that moved a crowd of 50 might one day move a nation. By the end of that decade, he was no longer just a local favorite. He was a name being whispered in the halls of radio stations and small studios. The stage that once seemed too small for his dreams was now preparing him for something much larger. Because what came next wasn't another bar gig. It was the moment that changed everything. The breakthrough that would turn the garage worker from East Texas into one of country music's most enduring voices. As the 1960s faded into the 1970s, Gene Watson found himself standing at a crossroads. The garage was still there, the long hours and clanging tools unchanged, but something inside him had shifted. He'd spent years perfecting his craft in smoky dance halls and honky-tonks, shaping a sound that was unmistakably his own, raw yet refined, traditional yet soulful. And though he didn't know it yet, the world beyond Texas was finally ready for that sound. One night, during a show in Houston, fate took an unexpected turn. A local DJ named Roy Stone happened to be in the crowd. He'd heard plenty of singers come and go, but something about Gene's performance that night stopped him cold. There was no pretense in the man's delivery, just unfiltered emotion and phrasing that made every lyric feel like it belonged to the listener. After the show, Stone approached him backstage, introduced himself. Stone connected Gene with a few producers who were looking for new voices to record regional singles. The sessions were modest, nothing fancy, just a rented studio with a few musicians. But when Gene stepped up to the microphone, something extraordinary happened. The engineers, hardened by years in the business, looked at each other in silence as his voice filled the room. It wasn't loud or flashy, it was honest. They cut a handful of songs, and among them was a little track titled "Love in the Hot Afternoon." At first, the song was released on a small Texas label. It didn't have national promotion or big marketing behind it. Just a handful of radio copies and Gene's growing local fan base. But then, something remarkable happened. The song refused to die. Listeners started calling into radio stations, requesting it again and again. DJs across the South began spinning it, and soon the record's reach extended far beyond Texas borders. By the summer of 1975, Love in the Hot Afternoon had climbed the Billboard country charts, reaching the top 5. A stunning feat for a singer who had spent most of his life in auto shops and roadside bars. Overnight, Gene Watson became a name to remember. Nashville began calling. But what truly set Gene apart wasn't just that hit. It was what came after. Many artists stumble once the spotlight hits them. Gene, however, seemed to grow strong. His humility never left, and his sound never bent to commercial trends. Critics described his voice as country's purest tenor, a tone that could glide through heartbreak or hope with equal grace. Unlike many newcomers chasing crossover fame, Gene remained faithful to the honky-tonk tradition that had raised him. He began releasing one classic after another: Paper Rosie, Farewell Party, 14 Karat Mind. Each song told a story, painted a feeling, and connected him deeper to the working-class fans who saw themselves in his lyrics. His music wasn't about fame or glitter. It was about truth. That authenticity became his calling card. Even as country music started leaning toward pop influences, Gene held the line. He sang for the truck drivers, the factory workers, the night shift dreamers who understood what struggle felt like. And in doing so, he didn't just find an audience, he built a legacy. But with every rising career comes a heavier burden. Fame had opened doors, yes, but it also brought pressures that Gene had never faced before. Endless touring, demanding labels, and the quiet loneliness that came with success. Yet through it all, his voice never wavered. The same man who once sang after a long shift at the garage now stood before thousands, still carrying that same humble sincerity. And as his career soared into the late 1970s, Gene Watson wasn't just a country singer anymore. He was a symbol of endurance, proof that talent grounded in truth could outlast any trend. But even as applause grew louder, he began to realize that fame, like music, could be both a blessing and a burden. That realization would soon define the next chapter of his story, one marked not by meteoric rise, but by the quiet strength it takes to stay true in a changing world. When the roaring applause began to quiet and the crowds drifted home, Gene Watson was left with something far more demanding than a touring schedule: the slow, silent struggle with his own health. Years of relentless performing, sleepless nights, and constant travel had started to take a toll. His body, which had once powered through back-to-back shows and endless miles on the road, began sending warnings he could no longer ignore. It started subtly: fatigue that wouldn't fade, a cough that lingered, shortness of breath during long performances. But in true Watson fashion, he brushed it off. The show must go on, he'd tell his crew, tightening his guitar strap and walking back on stage. For a while, that grit worked. But eventually, even the strongest spirit meets its limits. In the early 2000s, the whispers grew louder. Rumors spread through the industry that Gene was facing serious health issues. It wasn't until later that he opened up publicly about what had been happening: a battle with cancer that had forced him to confront not just mortality, but legacy. The same man whose songs had carried millions through heartbreak and hardship now had to find strength in his own lyrics. Treatment wasn't easy. Chemotherapy left him exhausted, and the long days in hospitals felt worlds away from the spotlight he'd known for decades. Yet, even there, his faith held firm. Gene often said that he drew comfort from prayer and the quiet belief that his time wasn't done yet, that there were still songs to sing and stories to tell. "I didn't pray for a miracle," he once explained. "I prayed for the strength to keep walking through it." And walk through it he did. Fans who had loved him for his honesty now loved him even more for his resilience. When he finally returned to the stage, thinner but smiling, the standing ovation lasted longer than any song that night. It wasn't just a performance. It was a victory lap. The experience reshaped him. In interviews, he spoke about seeing life differently, cherishing simple joys he'd once overlooked. Morning coffee with his wife, quiet moments on the porch, the laughter of grandchildren. He began recording again, not out of ambition, but gratitude. His music from this period carried new depth, the same smooth tenor, but with an undercurrent of lived truth. Songs like "Jesus is All I Need" and "A Man Can Be a Good Thing" reflected the faith that carried him through. The stage became less about fame and more about connection. He often told audiences, "If I can make one person feel less alone tonight, then I've done my job." Through it all, he remained humble. No dramatic comebacks, no loud declarations, just steady persistence. And that quiet strength inspired not just his fans, but younger country artists who saw in Gene the rarest kind of example, a man who refused to let illness define him. As his health stabilized, he slowly returned to touring. Smaller venues, slower pace, but the same devotion. Those who saw him perform in the years following his recovery said there was something different about him, a serenity, a gratitude that filled every note. He no longer sang to chase a chart position. He sang because it was his calling. And that calling, as it turned out, wasn't finished. Because Gene Watson was about to discover that his story, the one that had begun in dusty Texas fields and wound its way through decades of triumph and trial, still had one final, powerful act left. By the time Gene Watson entered his later years, he had long outlasted the trends that once threatened to push him aside. The industry that had once doubted whether traditional country could survive now looked to him as one of its last true standard-bearers. But what made his legacy remarkable wasn't just the number of albums or charting singles. It was the quiet consistency of a man who never stopped honoring the roots that raised him. In a world of auto-tune and digital fame, Gene remained proudly analog, both in sound and in soul. He still believed that a song should make you feel before it made you think. His performances became less about spectacle and more about storytelling, the kind that made you lean in and listen. When he sang "Farewell Party" in later years, the audience didn't just hear a hit. They heard decades of experience poured into every word. Younger artists began to notice. Many of today's country singers, from traditionalists like Cody Johnson to legends like George Strait, have cited Gene as an influence, a reminder that truth and tone never go out of style. In 2019, when he was invited to join the Grand Ole Opry, the honor wasn't just a career milestone. It was a full-circle moment. For the boy who once sang in East Texas churches, it was validation that staying true to your roots could indeed carry you all the way to country music's most sacred stage. But even with such recognition, Gene never allowed ego to cloud his humility. In interviews, he'd laugh when asked about being called a legend. "A legend," he'd reply with that familiar grin, "I'm just doing what I've always done, singing what's real." That authenticity became the secret to his longevity. As years passed, his story grew into something larger than music. Fans who had listened to him for decades often said that his songs marked the milestones of their own lives. Weddings, heartbreaks, road trips, funerals. His voice had become part of their memories, and in many ways, That's the truest kind of immortality an artist can have. Even now, when Gene walks on stage, there's no pretense. Just the same man with a microphone, a guitar, and an unshakable sense of purpose. Each show feels like a homecoming, a quiet conversation between an artist and his audience. When he bows his head at the end of a song, it isn't a performance flourish. It's gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for faith, and for a lifetime spent doing what he loves. Looking back, Gene Watson's life reads less like a rise and fall tale and more like a testament to endurance. He didn't chase fame. He earned respect. He didn't reinvent himself to stay relevant. The world came back around to appreciate what he'd been all along. And as country music continues to evolve, his name stands as proof that the genre's heart still beats strongest in stories told with honesty and soul. Gene Watson never needed smoke or flash, just a song, a stage, and the truth. So when the lights dim and that familiar voice fills the room one more time, it isn't just nostalgia. It's living history. The sound of a man who never quit, never faked, and never forgot where he came from. And perhaps that's the greatest farewell party of all. Not the end of a career, but the celebration of a life that stayed beautifully, stubbornly, authentically country to the very last note. Longer under it.